So yeah, the title of this is The Struggle Against Henry Hyndman's Militarism in the British Socialist Party, and I'm going to cover 1909 to 1914 in particular. In recent times, I've become a bit more of a kind of lover of literal kind of titles. This goes back to an experience I had like about 4 or 5 years ago when I went into central London to watch a performance of Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap. I remember you've seen that. So I went along to that performance and I sat through it for 45 minutes. Went down to the reception and said, I want a refund. And they said, why do you want a refund? And I said, well, I've come to see Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap. And I came here on, in good faith that this was going to be a play about pest control, but I haven't seen any mousetrap at all belonging to Agatha or anybody else. I haven't seen anybody dressed up as a mouse, and I haven't seen any rodents whatsoever. So since that time, I've been a much more of a fan of kind of literal titles. They asked me to leave the theatre because they thought I was a loony, which I am, but on this point, I think I was right. Because if you go and see Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats, you know what you're going to get, don't you? You're going to get a load of cats, jumping around the stage, hanging around a cat flat, waiting for a plate of whiskers or licking their own genitals. You know what Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats is about. So this title was written very much with that in mind, to be literal. So it says what's on the kind of tin. For those of you who are more intellectual, though I'm not a logical positivist, if you follow that line of thought, so I don't want to mislead you on that. Only 1% of you will get that joke, but that's fine. I also apologise to our international guest. I'm afraid my humour is like very English, and it's usually incomprehensible to kind of foreign visitors. So you just have to take that and just use the internet to look it all up later, which is what most people kind of do. This is not going to be, I'm not going to give you like a narrative kind of potted history of the British Socialist Party. There will be some of that, of course, inevitably, a lot involved in this. And don't worry, you are going to know what's going on and who's saying what. But I don't actually, I'm not a big fan of those more type empirical type talks, because I think people tend to wade around in a kind of fog of detail in them. There will be some detail in this, but it will be pertinent to kind of like the main narrative, which will be more of an interpretive kind of one. If you want to find out stuff about Henry Hyndman and more about the BSP and its predecessor organisations, there's plenty of sources online, including a free PhD by Martin Crick. And so therefore, if you're interested in it, you can go and look up those details quite easily. I suppose what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a kind of dispute that happened in the British Socialist Party before the First World War. And I'm going to try and use that as a kind of force field to kind of show you some of the forces and some of the forces and some of the kind of things that were at work during that kind of phase. So it's going to be along those lines, and that way hopefully you can work out some of the main kind of relations and kind of oppositions that existed in that organization. And I think that'll be more fruitful than me saying in 1870, going from that kind of point. Neither will I be using what I consider to be a rather dopey method that most 20th century British socialists have used in looking back at organizations like the BSP. Basically, that method runs something like along these kind of lines. Formally, you work out which of the predecessor organizations of the CPGB were the closest to your own sex policies in the 20th and 21st centuries. You pick that organization, you applaud it to the skies, and everybody else, you damn them all to kind of buggery. So it's like this kind of selection and picking. I don't want to do any of that either, because history is much more complex than that. And it's just formalism, really, that kind of method. And I'm not interested in that either. So yes, I am concentrated on the BSP, and I think the BSP, from when I've been looking at the sources, and I think it's a very important organization. but I'm not, I'm not working out some linear kind of majestic kind of road to the CPGB and international communism. That's not what I'm doing. All of these organizations were flawed, all of their leaders were flawed, and all their characters were flawed, but some of them had some good things in them as well, and things that we can kind of learn from. So I hope that that's kind of clear. I'm not going to do a massive empirical kind of thing, but hopefully you will learn quite a lot about it. Having said all that, for reasons of orientation, and this will be completely useless for the online viewers inadvertently strayed onto this kind of broadcast. I have put up there, you probably can't read that either, but I have put a chart up there which actually lays out some of the kind of background to these organizations. Very skeletal, very schematic, but I'll also just talk about that briefly for the online viewer. So this talk is primarily dealing with, in its British context, it was prior to 1908, this organization was known as the Social Democratic Formation, which is the SDF. In 1908, it changed after a kind of fusion process, again, which I haven't really got time to go into. It changed and it was known as the Social Democratic Party. That was from 1908 to 1911. And then it became the British Socialist Party from 1911. Now, these organizations were all actually, to some extent, dominated politically and financially by Henry Hyndman, who for whatever are these manifold faults, some of which we're going to discover in this session, Henry Hyndman was somebody who had an enormous influence on British Marxism. I mean, that can't be discounted. I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture of him, and there's plenty of barbed criticism amongst authoritative figures in the world of communism against Henry Hyndman. But it was undoubtedly true that he had a vast amount of influence, and you're going to see some of that in action kind of here. He was the founder of the SDF, and he was an important figure in the development of Marxism in Britain. Came from the Conservatives actually, but I'm not going to go too much into the detail of that because you can read about that kind of separately. But basically, what this talk, I've put article here because I wrote it as an article. So if you refer to article, I mean talk. If I mean, you get the picture. This talk covers the period in which Hyndman's influence really began to wane in the pre-First World War period. Before Hyndman's faction of the British Socialist Party, they supported British imperialism in the First World War and became a thoroughgoing kind of social imperialist, which we're going to look at the prehistory of that in this kind of talk. Hyndman and his faction were eventually forced out of the BSP by its anti-war left in 1916. And Hyndman's faction, they formed the small National Socialist Party, which is really, which is not a popular name anymore for some reason or another. You don't hear it. John did once try and foist it upon the Scottish Socialists, but they didn't want it either for some reason. So the National Socialist Party, and both of these organisations, the National Socialist Party of Hyndman and the British Socialist Party, they both affiliated to the Labour Party in the First World War. I don't have time to go into that interesting issue here, but both of them affiliated to Labour as well during this process of the split. Henry Hyndman retained control of Justice, which was always the paper of the Social Democratic Federation down for his predecessors. He retained control of Justice after the 1916 break. Justice was an important British socialist publication in terms of its range and scope. But again, I don't have time to go into it except to tell you that Justice, there was an open debate in Justice between all the factions of the BSP right through this period and right up through to the split in the First World War. It was an open debate, and although there was lots of barbs flying around the editorial policy if it was good. So you'd have an editorial from Hyndman's mob, and then in the back pages, you'd have lots of correspondence from enraged kind of anti-war kind of leftists. But this was all open, and you can actually, it's actually in the British Newspaper Archive. You can get that from most British libraries. I'm not trying to sell it to you. There we go. So what this, so basically, if I say SDF, SDP, BSP, there were differences, but for the sake of this talk, I'm talking about an organizational continuity about this kind of organization. And yeah, so that's just a little bit of kind of narrative kind of background just to anchor you in what you're kind of looking at. I'm not going to be able to talk about, you know, the whole debate about imperialism in the Second International or even in the British movement either, because of time constraints, but you'll get a flavour of some of it. So basically, this talk is going to argue that through the example of like inner party struggle around basically what was an issue of disarmament and military armaments and bourgeois military in the British socialist movement in the run-up to 1914. The Second International exercised a very distinct moral authority over its activists. Now, with the practical and moral collapse in 1914 of major parts and players of the Second International with the onset of the imperialist war in 1914, there was very obviously a gap between professed political commitments and their realization. Nevertheless, I'm going to argue in this kind of paper, in this talk, that the Second International's ethical power, it can't be dismissed as a nothing, particularly when it comes to its anti-militarist left wing. Comrade Mike Tabor, some comrades probably know his book about the resolutions of the Second International. He's argued in relation to the Second International that no mechanism existed for the implementation of the Second International's decisions, even after the 1900 creation of the International Socialist Bureau as the movement's executive body. Resolutions were often not put into practice, and in the derisive words of the early Comintern, the Second International functioned essentially as a mailbox, which was Zinoviev's famous phrase about the Second International. Mike Tabor adds that such an appreciation was undoubtedly exaggerated and unfair, given that the parties of the Second International regularly carried out important internationally coordinated actions during this period. Now, there was a figure that some of you will know, Rajani Palm Dutt. He was the kind of theoretician of the official Communist Party of Great Britain, the old official party. He was, to some degree, the party's kind of leading intellectual. Later on in his life, he wrote some studies of the development of the International, which actually are very interesting and actually got quite a lot of praise if you actually look back to the 1960s for being fairly kind of open-minded and fairly methodical and fairly kind of thorough. I'm not making a defense of Dutt. I'm not particularly a fan of his political kind of trajectory, but it was undoubtedly true. And people like Eric Hobsbawm were saying, look, these books are worth reading. And it was kind of a well-received and unexpected, partly because Dutt himself was moving into opposition in the CPGB at that point over issues around Czechoslovakia. And it did lead to a certain kind of distance, and he was distanced from the leadership. Now, that doesn't mean Dutt's theory is perfect, of course, it's far from it. And it's got a lot of the old cobblers within that kind of study. But Dutt, he offered an iteration of Zinoviev's idea, albeit rendered in the English form of post office. That's what, just for Americans, that's what we call post mailboxes, post offices, post box, stating that neither the Second International Executive or the ISB, the International Socialist Bureau, attempted to fulfill any role of international leadership, nor had they any authority over the national parties. And this is what Dutt added to this. And he said, at the most, the Second International leadership, attempted a moral intervention in favour of socialist unity, where there was a division of parties in one country. Dutt was very, very careful in his analysis of the Second International and generally sought to follow Lenin's argument around tracing the precise kind of contradictions of the Second International, i.e. a growth in breadth accompanied by an increasing kind of opportunism, and which you can read in Lenin's 1919 article, The Third International and in Its Place in History. But I think this is clearly a case of a pudding being over-egged by Dutt. I think he was over amplifying the Socialist International's lack of authority and leadership. One can find plenty of evidence illustrating the authority of the Second International and its pronouncements over British activists up to 1914. As Dutt implied, this was often cast in a moral form. That's often how it's cast, through appeals by left-wing militants to the previously agreed politics of the Second International. But this, I would argue, this had profound practical consequences for the Marxist left in the inner party struggle inside organisations such as the BSP, which eventually, as I've told you, split with the social imperialists in 1916. And some of its activists were thus set on the road to forming the CPGB, some of its activists. This is not a linear kind of path. There was breakaways from people who didn't like the BSP affiliating to the Third International around Edwin Fairchild, which I don't have time to go into. So there's no, I'm not arguing for some kind of linear kind of development here. But this long tussle over armaments that I'm going to talk to you about, and anti-war militarism, is the essential kind of prehistory of the CPGB in some ways. Indeed, Dutt's critique relies precisely upon abstracting the idea of the Second International's moral authority from its material relations, the structures and actions that are embedded in such moral authority. But however, post offices do take some practical organising. Mailbox takes some organisation. They're not just an abstract thing that just appears from nowhere. And this is the problem really when you try and isolate ethical power from all the other kind of constituent material factors of the Second International. If you abstract it like Dutt has done, then you're in a position where you can more easily kind of discount it. Moral authority, mailboxes, postboxes were embedded in material relations in the Second International. Otherwise, they couldn't have functioned as postboxes or you know, even on that level. Basically, ethical power should, in the Second International's case, it shouldn't be marooned on a kind of remote methodological island and treated as a mere kind of appearance that had no history or something that emerged from nowhere and nothing, because that's not true. There are also problems with the implied alternative that lurks behind these types of these critiques of the Second International as a kind of loose and disaggregated federation that exerted only an occasional ethical pull on its adherents. This was clear as far back as 1921. Then CPGB leader Tom Bell discussed the Third Congress of the Comintern and its recently agreed thesis on the organisational struggle of the Communist parties and the methods and content of their work, and the famous thesis, organisational thesis. Bell said, the Third International, unlike the Second or Two and a Half International, which was formed after the First World War, is not a mere post office. It is an organised militant machine for struggle against international imperialism. Despite a brief nod to the possibility of some national autonomy, it becomes obvious that Bell's is a militaristic model of organisation. Formal democracy is simply equated with the bureaucracies of power and passivity seen to be inherent in the Second International. However, Bell's alternative of democratic centralisation, which was presaged on the idea of a strong leadership ready for war and capable of adaptability, and he also said that the worst form of undisciplined conduct was to hinder or break the unity of the common front. Now, this is very, very obviously the over-centralised model that helped produce the bureaucratization of the Comintern and its subsequent kind of micro-imitators in Trotskyist and Marxist-Leninist oil slick internationals. This alternative to the Second International has decisively failed in the 20th and 21st century. However, at least in countries such as Britain, when you were far enough away from Soviet bullets and the bullets of the bureaucracy and the prisoners of the bureaucracy, that happened in not many British communists went to Russian jail. A few of them did, but most of them were able to avoid that. The authority of the Comintern among its activists in places like Britain was usually organised around a strong ethical imperative, where it was generally believed, completely wrongly, as we know, that Stalin and the Soviet Union were an effective leadership in the struggle for communism. That was a belief that people had in places like Britain. This had material consequences when, for example, the CPGB in the main swung behind the idea that the Second World War was imperialist in 1939. And Dutt admitted all this, when he was trying to rationalize the Soviet Union's 1943 liquidation of the Comintern. And Dutt said, the removal of external organizational forms of expression of international communist unity, fuck me, what's synthesis and discipline, only increases the importance of the voluntary self-discipline of all communists and communist parties in maintaining unity, cooperation, and common understanding between communist parties and fidelity to the obligations of international working class solidarity. But note Dutt's phrase, increases the importance, this kind of voluntary kind of self-discipline. This was something that had already emerged in the 1920s and 30s. Even within the Soviet Union, we know of many communists who went to the grave with Stalin's name on their, all hail Comrade Stalin on their lips. So even there, but obviously over in the Soviet Union, it was the executioner's bullet that was, going to be more kind of decisive than in a place like Britain. But I would argue that both the Second and Third Internationals took this form of voluntary self-discipline allied to either relatively decentralized or over-centralized bureaucracies, and both ended up in disaster during World War. While we should reject these kind of binary choices around these two models, second and third, it is highly unlikely that it will be possible to dispense with voluntary self-discipline as an important mediatory factor in future proletarian organizations. I don't think you can do without some form of ethical kind of power allied to the material structures. To that end, the moral authority of the Second International, illustrated by the British anti-imperialist left between 1909 and 1914, should not be treated as a mere accoutrement of institutional failure. If it is treated in such a fashion, then it must be asked as to why on earth leading figures of the post-Second International left insisted upon reviving what Lenin called in summer 1915 the now forgotten ideals of genuine socialism. And as I kind of argued in Ben's session yesterday, I think to some degree, Lenin's optimism about the future was kind of presaged on the fact that the Second International had nurtured such elements, radical left-wing elements, with their continuing commitment to the previous anti-war ideals of the socialist. The Second International agreed in conferences such as Stuttgart in 1907. You'll be glad to know that after that excursion, we're actually coming on to Britain now. So that's only taken 25 minutes. So that's quite quick. But Lenin himself, just to get as an in on this kind of argument, Lenin wrote and took sides with the British SDP, BSP, anti-militarist left on several occasions. Lenin took clear exception to the actions and arguments of Henry Hyndman. As you remember, who's the leader and the kind of founder of these organizations. In Lenin's words of 1913, Hyndman has got it into his head that Germany is threatening to crush and enslave Britain, and that socialists should therefore support the demand for a proper, i.e. strong, navy for the defence of Britain. Socialists in the role of supporters of a strong navy, I think Lenin's been ironical here, and this in a country whose navy helps enslave and plunder in the most shameless feudal manner the 300 millions of India's population, tens of millions of people in Egypt and other colonies. And this wasn't, these types of views that Lenin was objecting to, they weren't, unfortunately, an isolated occurrence on the part of Henry Hyndman. As far back as 1881, one can find him musing on an idea that has kind of long since crossed over into the kind of neoliberal lexicon, i.e. noble British, or it's always English in Hyndman's rendering, interventions on the side of democratic forces, leveraging, in this 19th century instance, Britain's naval power. And this I'm going to quote from Hyndman again. Lying apart from the continent of Europe and practically free from the risk of invasion, we can not only shelter men who are driven from their country for mere political offences, but we can rightfully stand forth at the critical moment on behalf of those who at present think that England must necessarily range herself on the side of conservatism, which has come to be revolutionary. Each nation, doubtless, must work out its own social troubles, but a combination of despotisms can only be met and overcome by a combination of peoples. The true alliances for England in the future are the democracies of Europe, and her real strength is on the sea, which is his rationale for supporting the British imperialist navy. By the point Hyndman reached the second round of biographical writings in 1912, this standpoint had become focused on what one of the chapters of this second biography called the German menace. In response to German militarism, Hyndman advocated the permanent maintenance of a British fleet sufficiently powerful to secure domination of the narrow seas under all circumstances, and the safety of the trade routes so far as this may be achieved. Like all good socialist imperialists, Hyndman denied that he was in any way chauvinist, stressing his admiration for the German working class and German social democracy. He also tried to square this with the pronouncedness of the Second International in recognition of the latter's ideological pull and to add political gravitas to his claims. Hyndman argued, we would give up armaments, sweep away militarism and put an end to competition in all countries upon the grounds of economy in its widest sense, as well as of humanity. But as present, things being as they are, we have decided that at all international congresses that we, as we are internationalists and not anti-nationalists, a national citizen army in each nationality to be used for its own defence is desirable. So Hyndman's trying to square off his kind of social imperialism with the resolutions of the Second International, which we'll discuss the criticisms of that in a minute. Friedrich Engels had characterized Hyndman back in 1883 as an arch conservative and someone who was extremely chauvinistically minded. In a similar vein, Engels told Karl Kautsky in 1884 that Hyndman was a petty and hard-faced John Bull, possessing a vanity considerably in excess of his talent and natural gifts. I don't think he likes him. So Hyndman's propensity to British chauvinism, clearly present in his attitude to the British Navy, had been noted by others. Fierce inner-party debates, all publicly reported in the pages of Justice, sprung up over Hyndman's militarism in 1909, 1910, and 1912. The latter was provoked by Hyndman's new biography, which was Hyndman's biography was something of importance to the bourgeois press, and it was widely kind of reported on, especially when he talked about the German menace, and it was widely covered by those types of papers. These kind of debates, they all followed a familiar pattern of Hyndman kind of exploding into print on the topic of the German menace, aided and abetted by the lead columns of Justice. This was generally followed by furious open correspondence as party members and branches strove to disassociate themselves from Hyndman's rank social imperialism. We will mostly use the debate from 1910 as the main example of such disputes. this kind of years ago when we were like polemicizing with the AWL, I remember we saw this kind of same kind of thing, this on Sean McGammer's part, this kind of propensity to kind of explode into print at various points. What that kind of generally means is that Hyndman was beginning to feel hemmed in his own organisation by the left, and I think that's also been true of Sean McGammer, when the AWL is a pygmy compared to the BSP, which was a pygmy, if you know what I mean. I'm not comparing them like that, but the same kind of mechanisms happen. SEC leaders get hemmed in, and then they have to explode in their own publications because that's what they've kind of been left with, because they feel kind of threatened. So it's actually interesting, some of reading about Henry Hyndman's really like fuck you kind of like a way of like writing about these things, and the bludgeoning kind of tone. Although Hyndman was actually a skillful kind of writer, as you can kind of hear, he could use the English language, but it was exactly the same kind of thing. You know, Sean McGammer, obviously, some people can't use the English language. You can't use it for poetry anyway. So anyway. Resolutions against standing armies and in favour of the general arming of the population had been agreed by the Second International in 1889. Excuse me, 1893 and 1907. For Hyndman, the British Army stood in place of such a citizen army. As being dependent for 6/7 of our food on foreign countries, we could be starved out. And because conscription or compulsory service not being adopted here, the country is liable to sudden and partially successful attack, even by an inferior force, should the mastery of the narrow seas pass from us temporarily. Some of Hyndman's critics thought this parallel that he drew between Second International advocated citizen armies and the British Navy was absurd. This was Edwin Fairchild, who was a member of the SDP's BSP Central Hackney branch. Central Hackney branch was the hotbed of rebellion against Hyndman, with various figures in the branch taking up cudgels. But Fairchild argued the British Navy cannot take the place of a citizen force, insomuch as it cannot be used against the governing class. Its units are beyond the scope of the civil law in time of peace, and it is entirely moved from the sphere of public control. Therefore, it is a very serious matter for the SDP or one of its members to be opposed on this point to the opinion of the Socialist Party throughout the world. As with Hyndman, the party left appeal to the authority of the International, the moral authority of the International, on this disputed point. One might ask why Hyndman, as at least a formal admirer of German social democracy, would not expect his German comrades to play a role in dealing with the militarization of its own governing class. In fact, Hyndman was thoroughly defeatist in relation to the idea that German social democrats could check any determined act of hostility against either England or France. He added, the latter theory I never believed for a moment, but I asked August Bebel and others point blank whether anything could be done by them if a serious attempt were made by socialists in France and England to check any counter hostile move. They told me plainly no, that at the first call to arms, that they will be enabled to check mobilization. Though, as in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, they will be prepared to run great risks by way of protests. What might happen later, nobody could foretell. So Hyndman was thoroughly pessimistic about the German Social Democrats being able to deal with their ruling class. In July 1910, Hyndman again exploded into print on the naval issue, this time in the pages of the bourgeois Morning Post, which was highly inflammatory to its members. Hyndman argued that socialists of all people ought to be the last to run any risk of allowing Prussianized Germany to become dominant in the North Sea and the Channel. Justice then received a deluge of critical comments and complaints from around the SDP. Several branches, mostly in the London area, wrote in to disassociate themselves from Hyndman's views. Many oppositionists drew attention to the fact that Hyndman had stepped outside the political boundaries of the Second International, demonstrating that the latter's anti-militarism had taken hold of political imaginations. Therefore, John Askew argued that Hyndman's Morning Post missive would bring him more than an unpleasant quarter of an hour at the 1910 Copenhagen Congress, since his letters amounted to nothing more nor less than a throwing overboard of the entire principles of international socialism. Similarly, William Morgan argued, as party to the International Congress, the English social democracy is bound by its rulings, and Comrade Hyndman, in his capacity as leader of the English party, is bound, among others. It therefore behoves him as a leader to see to it his declarations are in conformity with international socialist policy. On this question, he has failed to do so. Zelda Khan of Central Hackney Branch said, "We have a right to expect that as a leader of the Social Democratic Party, Hyndman should not use his name to advocate a policy which is what is contrary to the spirit of every socialist organisation of note. Clearly, the notion of being in an international that was aligned with sister socialist organisations and that had distinct principles and issues such as armaments of war had an impact on Hyndman's opponents in Britain and partly facilitated their opposition." There was then a long spat over an article that appeared in Forwards, which I don't have time to kind of run into the kind of blow by blow account of that. But basically what happened was that there was an article in Forwards, that this German Social Democratic Party paper, dealing with this kind of these kinds of disputes and dealing with it actually made negative comment about Hyndman and also Robert Blatchford of the Clarion newspaper, who also started producing patriotic anti-German kind of nonsense in this period as well. Forwards commented on this in the context of a longer kind of more theoretical kind of argue, but Vorwärts distanced itself from Hyndman and Blatchford and severely criticised them. The problem with the Vorwärts article is it repeated very much the understanding that Karl Kautsky had of imperialism in the pamphlet that Mike McNair wrote an introduction to. It basically downplayed German imperialism and played up the free trade credentials, free trade liberal credentials of British imperialism. I don't have time to go into all that there, but then there was a long kind of spat over this, and basically what Hyndman and Justice did is they reproduced the German arguments against their own imperialists and their criticism of the German ruling class to kind of fan the flames of anti-German feeling in Britain. That's what they were kind of using it for. And Zelda Khan, who's kind of the kind of heroine of this piece, replied to this, and I think it's worthwhile repeating this because it shows what actually strong principles there were in the Second International. She said, "What we say is that if Germany is a tiger, England is a lion, and that any quarrel between them both are to blame. The duty of social democrats in each country is to try and tame, or at least keep in check, its own wild beast. And the way to do that is not to fan popular resentment against the other country, but by pointing out the faults of our own government to get the people to force on them a peaceful and less provocative policy. Our German comrades understand this." I actually didn't think they did in entirety. "They therefore make light of England's blame in this matter and attack their government for all they are worth. We, on the other hand, play directly into the hands of the Jingos by helping to throw stones and dirt to the German beast as though England were a poor, white, innocent, wrong little lamb." So Khan had this kind of conception that you had to deal with the main enemy. There's a version of a kind of softer version of the main enemy as at home is kind of embedded in that. But this debate, it went from, so we're going now from the debate in Britain, so we've seen it received in the German Social Democratic Party, who commented upon this debate at length. It also came onto the floor, excuse me, of the Second International's Copenhagen Conference in August, September 1910. German SPD SPD member George Ledebour, who's a journalist and a member of the Reichstag, a Reichstag deputy for the organisation. He took the opportunity, occasion offered, to criticise the defence of British naval supremacy by figures in the British socialist movement. And Ledebour was particularly scathing about the attitude of the whole British movement in general, and that was both independent Labour Party activists and SDP activists during the Congress debate on armaments. So this debate has then reached the conference floor of the Second International's major organisation. The ISB, the permanent organisation of the Second International, declared to the Congress that it would support all socialist organisations in their fight against militarism, and endeavour to bring about a united action which kind of confirmed the anti-militarist thrust of a previous resolution at the 1907 Stuttgart Congress. To this, a French socialist, Edouard Vaillant, and the ILP's Keir Hardie, they proposed what will become a rejected amendment around using a general strike as one of the means to prevent and hinder war. This sparked George Ledebour's comments about the British delegation on the Congress Commission on Arbitration and Disarmament. And basically, he took the piss out of the whole kind of lot of them. He said about the ILP's Bruce Glazier, he mocked him for thinking that wars were caused by the savage animal instincts of man rather than by capitalism. Such sentiments must be attributed to youthful innocence and would doubtless find favour in a young man's Christian association. Ledebour denied that the general strike tactic advocated by Vaillant and Keir Hardie had any universal application before unveiling an attack on the standing of the whole British delegation to the Congress. He said, "I read in justice that we demur, i.e. demur means object, to the abolition of the right of capture of naval vessels. I deny to those who object to the abolition of this kind of piracy the moral right to advocate here the general strike." So he's pointing to, he's saying basically, your delegation's got no standing because of all this rubbish you've been arguing. This point of controversy about the right of capture had been raised by Zelda Khan, who queried whether justice's support for the right of capture, i.e. the right of capture of naval vessels, was something that clearly favoured a much stronger British Navy. So it's something that if you were a British navalist, you would advocate the right of capture because you've got more fucking ships than anybody else and you can impose your will. So it's chauvinism, right? But an editorial note in response to Zelda Khan said, "There was no misprint. The opinion has been expressed many times in our columns. War is war, not a game of chess." And that's Hyndman talking. Ledebour denounced Labour Party members who were arguing for the general strike tactic while their parliamentary representatives were voting for armaments. He said, "You, Ramsay MacDonald, and your party are practical politicians, so practical that you lose sight of principles. By what right do you take it upon yourselves to commit other people to the general strike against war when you do not in your own country take up the same anti-militarist position as the Socialist Party in all other countries? So long as you vote the budget and thereby the arming of the British soldiery, you cannot come to us with more far-reaching proposals." So in one sense, there is clearly an element about all this, an element of mailbox about this, about given that although socialists could strongly imply that the words of Hyndman put him outside the movement, he remained in situ until 1916, when eventually he was defeated in the BSP, as we've mentioned. However, I would say in response to that, partly, that the movement was being thoroughly educated in socialist principle through this debate, and Ledebour's contextualization of Hyndman's reactionary kind of diatribes amid the woes of the ILP's pacifism and the pro-militarist actions of Labour Party members in the British Parliament, I think it was very cutting. Principle and debate, i.e. messages and discourse, or a mailbox, if you want to call it that, they cannot be dispensed with, and too often the implied alternative to this second international culture is non-debate and a kind of atavistic kind of sense of action presided over by sec sergeant majors, which is at best warmed over early Comintern, or at worst warmed over official communism of the Stalin years. It turns out that the mailbox is important if the letters inside reflect a genuine debate around principle. Similarly, on the potential expulsion of those who'd fallen foul of the International's anti-militarism, Hyndman was clearly a recidivist, a repeat offender in terms of his social imperialism, and far gone on his road. But on the other hand, it was important for the German SDP and the British left wing to address the rank and file of the ILP and the broader movement on the errors of its leadership. The latter being inside the International, i.e. the opportunist wing, meant that at least a kind of trough of British ethical, practical politics, pro-imperialist garbage could be kind of dissected and combated. Lederbourg denied the British right, Lederbourg denied the British delegation a moral right to propose anti-militarist actions to the International, given its record. But while that might be read as an unfortunate concession to ILP ethics, such denials had practical educative consequences that reverberated far into the future. Another facet of these debates that shouldn't be treated as a mere accoutrement of Second International failure is the polite tone involved in some of the British debates, at least. For example, Zelda Khan wrote of Hyndman in August 1910, "It is sad enough to think that the teacher whom we all love and admire so much should have fallen into such a morass." And this was Khan's very, that's a polite way of referring to Hyndman. And it's also a recognition that Hyndman was somebody who had a kind of moral authority to the British socialist movement. And so obviously that was a kind of tactical move. This tone of debate continued into the SDP's Congress of April 1911. A Justice editorial noted that in all discussions, there was an entire absence of acrimony and bitterness and a display of good feeling. This kind of all took on a slight political edge when the editorial also commented upon the sharpest differences of opinion, combined with the rather hopeful assessment that such differences were neither deep nor wide. I think that's wishful thinking. Similarly, in the report on the Congress debate, Zelda Khan, who moved a Central Hackney resolution that called upon the organisation, his executive organ, and individual members to combat with the utmost urgent energy the demands for additional armaments, was said by Justice to have delivered an extremely able speech. This resolution and Khan's speech in support were commented upon approvingly by Lenin in 1911. Hyndman supporters weren't always so charitable, actually, and Zelda Khan was the object of a slur by one of the BSP's right-wing members, Victor Fischer. He referred to her as Fraulein Zelda Khan in i.e. pro-German in January 1913. Zelda Khan was actually of Jewish origin and from Russia, actually, and their family had settled in Britain. So despite Zelda Khan's apparently polite tone, the politics of Khan's intervention in 1911 were noticeably sharp. Just for example, the English Navy was kept to maintain the empire. Never had the SDP made a bigger and more terrible mistake than in identifying the party with the Jingo warmonger. They had placed themselves outside of the international movement. Looking back in 1968, Zelda Khan gave some indication of her feelings around the tone of political debate when she remembered attending a conference of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in Brotherhood Church, Dalston in May 1907. This is what Zelda Khan said about that gathering. "I sat in the gallery as a visitor, listening to the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks who sat in a body on opposite sides of the hall. The discussions were so furious, they attacked one another so fiercely, using the most insulting words, that I was really astounded. Now, of course, Khan's writing in 1968, so later in a kind of Leninist kind of narrative of this, Zelda Khan, she pictures Lenin as putting an arm around her and correcting her in a fatherly manner when she voices some of her surprise in the tone of this debate. But it is obvious that back in 1910-11, the young Zelda Khan hadn't adopted this furious tone of debate, which is still being badly mimicked by sect leaders to this day, without any noticeable deleterious effect on the sharp political differences being expressed. Sometimes, as in this case, politeness and an even tone pays dividends, while on other occasions, the type of mockery that George Ledabor inflicted on British socialists in 1910 is the order of the day. This kind of tone of polite debate and kindness towards Hyndman as a kind of father figure, it didn't endure inside the BSP. Some of you will be probably glad to know. When the by now anti-war majority was able to defeat Hyndman's pro-war clique in the BSP's 1916 Congress, there's evidence that the social imperialists were given the bird on their exit from the pie. An editorial injustice, which stayed under the control of Hyndman's faction, as I've explained, complained, "Booing is scarcely a dignified way of expressing disapproval of sentiments or action, and those who act in that fashion are not likely to be regarded as serious advocates of a greater change than any that has taken place in human society. Greybeards," which is clearly something aimed at Hyndman, because he had a fucking great big beard, would never be applied jeeringly to those who have devoted years of service to the socialist cause by anyone possessing the slightest sense of responsibility. But Hyndman's complete collapse into kind of chauvinism and the erosion of his political influence, it meant the kind of tactical kind of politeness towards it no longer served the less purposes. And it seems from the Justice Report that the attitude of the anti-war majority was one of fuck off. The reason I kind of raised that up is because politeness and the tone of debate has been an issue in the weekly work of this year. And I don't have any problem with the criticism made of Alex Callinicos. I've got no political kind of sympathy with. But I think the problem, that article which was written by Paul DeMarti, I kind of found that it was kind of like, yes, be critical of the politeness shown by Alex Callinicos to people to his right, pro-war shit. Yes, let's be critical of that. But I think the problem with that article is that it does have this kind of shadow image that as politicians we have to be kind of constantly this barking kind of sergeant major, like this kind of stuff. I think is tactical and it's kind of concrete. And the reason I kind of raised that up, because it used to be a debate in the kind of party as well. Many years ago, Mark Fisher wrote a party notes column which had the title "Brittle Bolsheviks," and Mark, which is I think it's worth dragging that out because it is interesting. And basically, what Mark was going to try and criticize that, and I think, and the reason I know this because it caused a massive fucking stink, because it was like a critique of like Manchester Cell as it was at that time. It was a critique of this kind of ultra hard, ultra kind of, we are the most committed, we are the hardest, and a very kind of swaggering kind of militant. And what that was kind of disguising, which I think Mark put his finger on, when you got down to it, was most of those people who used to have that type of culture, they were actually quite brittle, and their politics were really just were kind of just a pale reflection of things that they'd read in the weekly worker. They hadn't really kind of developed themselves, and I watched each one of them comrades disintegrate politically in front of my eyes, which Sir Mark was actually quite right to say brittle kind of Bolsheviks. And I think we have to. There's something in that. How you are in the kind of wider world, I think, is a tactical and a concrete type of thing. And I think while we have to be criticizing people who are diplomatic and excessively opportunist, I believe in that. It doesn't work in all circumstances. And I think sometimes, this kind of debate and the way Zelda Khan worked very, very effectively with politics that was sharp and praised by Lenin and did it in an incredibly polite tone. it worked in that context, it wouldn't work forever. Like I just want to be that, and I'd be I'm kind of slightly suspicious of this. It's kind of gone a bit out of fashion now since we've lost the kind of die with our boots on, the kind of old-fashioned Leninist vanguardism, which has kind of disappeared. So I think it's in that it's interesting. And you'll be glad to know this is this agony is nearly over of this literary farce is coming to an end. So, okay, we began this article with Dutt's claim, really, that the Second International exercised no real authority over its sections or activists. This case study from Britain partially undermines that view. When combating militarism, activists on its left consistently drew on the agreed positions of the International and stated that figures such as Hyndman had put themselves outside its fraternity, while Hyndman also attempted, much less successfully, to invoke the authority of the International on the issue of the citizen army. German and Russian socialists commented upon and intervened in debates in the British Party, and this also spilled over into its international congresses. It's true, actually, that the International had only a moral authority over its constituent parts, in line with Dutt's argument that it only really made moral interventions. We have to be careful about this phrase again, moral interventions, because these are moral interventions that's kind of poo-pooing. These actually made for united socialist organisations in places like France, and there was also a big attempt in Britain, which I haven't been able to refer to unite the socialist organisations and to get the BSP to affiliate to the kind of Labour Party. And yet that those moral interventions, I think, were actually quite important, nevertheless. However, it's doubtful that any proletarian organisation, militarised or non-militarised, could function without being mediated by a form of moral authority. This was also a socialist morality that was mediated itself by organisation. This moral authority was facilitated by journals, congresses, bodies, and branches. And these are the forms in which the debate over Hyndman's fallacies kind of sprung into life. Now, you don't have journals, congresses, and branches and bodies without having some material kind of form. So we need to be careful about just isolating moral authority as something set apart. What this actual, this moral authority, if we can call it that, the ethical life of the Second International, if you like to use Hegel's kind of phrase, it spawned an opposition that in Britain eventually defeated Hyndman and his cronies, moving some BSP members towards the formation of the CPGB in 1920. These are very practical, real-world consequences of all this stuff. Some Second International sections and their leaders collapsed in 1914 with disastrous consequences for the world movement and you'd kind of argue humanity. But some of its principled anti-militarism lived on in new forms that contained at least some of the promise of the old. That's it.